Well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Timothy, for joining us. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for
I
having me.
will kick off the program of this evening's talk with opening remarks regarding our distinguished speaker, Professor Timothy Brennan, and the co-sponsor of this event, the Archive Library. Again, thank you so much, Timothy, for being with us tonight. I'm Taysir Abouda, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at Al-Ahliya University, and it is my great pleasure to be the host of such a special and timely event. I want to thank the co-sponsor of this event, the Archive Library, and of course, I want to thank those who helped make this event possible. Special thanks go to the wonderful team of the Archive Library and the Department of English at Al-Ahliya Amman University for their unwavering support and collaboration. In particular, I want to single out the Dean of our faculty, Professor Nail Ashra'a, Dr. Agurit Khouri, Dr. Hanan Ibrahim, and all my colleagues. And last but not least, I want to welcome our special audience, those who join our meeting from different places across the globe. Timothy Brennan is an author, an activist, and a professor in the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature and English at the University of Minnesota. He has taught at many institutions as a distinguished visiting professor or senior research fellow, among them Humboldt University, Berlin, Cornell University, the University of California's Humanities Research Institute, the National Humanities Center, and the Center for Cultural Analysis. His essays have appeared in The Nation, Critical Inquiry, New Left Review, Transition, the Christian Science Monitor, the Toronto Star, the Times Literary Supplement, the London Review of Books, and many other publications. Timothy is the author of 8 books, 3 edited collections, and over 120 essays on post-colonial and world literatures, American intellectuals and the public, modernism and modernity, intellectual history, and popular music, especially the Afro-Latin music of the Americas. Among his books are At Home in the World, Cosmopolitanism, Now, Wars of Position, The Cultural Politics of Left and Right, Secular Devotion, After Afro-Latin Music and Imperial Jazz, and of course, and Borrowed Light, Vico, Hegel, and the Colonists. His intellectual biography, Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said, appeared in March of 2021. Since our event is a kind of discussion on Edward Said, I want to just mention this anecdote before we begin our conversation. But basically, I want to draw your attention that we're going to have a conversation with Professor Timothy for almost 45 minutes or so, and then we will give a chance for the audience to raise questions. In 2018, Hamid Dabashi was supposed to be a keynote speaker in Edward Said's memorial conference at Tunis University. I was assigned by my colleagues in Tunis to correspond with Hamid Dabashi. Although he couldn't make it, he sent me his abstract. In it, he said, if Edward Said were to come back to life today, he would not recognize the 3 words closest to his mind and his heart he left behind some 15 years ago when he died on 25 September 2003. He wouldn't believe what depth of terror and racism Donald Trump has unleashed in a country he called home for much of his adult life. He wouldn't recognize his beloved country, his beloved Arab world, either in the euphoria of the Arab Spring he would have loved to see, or in the savagery of the ISIS, the murderous mayhem in Yemen, the barefaced massacre of Palestinians in Gaza, or other atrocities elsewhere in his ancestral homeland, end quote. My first question for Timothy, in Mahmoud Darwish's Counterpoint, an elegy dedicated to Edward Said, Darwish writes, he says, I am from there, I am from here, but I am neither there nor here. I have two names that meet and part, and I have two languages I forgot with which I dream, in light of Darwish's lines. How would you locate Edward Said within Exile, Counterpoint, and in response to Darwish's lines?
Well, thank you for that beautiful and complex question. I think many people who know about Edward know that he was formally trained in music and for a long time thought that he would become a concert performer of the piano. So he studied counterpoint, actually. And so it isn't merely an image that he uses in his work, which people might be familiar with, where it comes to mean something like a many-sided and inclusive approach to debating those with whom you disagree, so that many different kinds of points of view can be held in counterpoint, as it were. That's typically how it's understood. But I think here, since really the nature of your question is about his identity, it's important to note to begin with that his antagonists, Edward's enemies, if I could put it that way, would frequently point to him as being inauthentic, right? As being somebody who is really a native, New Yorker who was thoroughly Americanized, commenting from a kind of professorial perch on events in the Middle East, and that he had no claim to an exilic identity. And I think that this is really fundamentally mistaken in lots of different ways. Number one, he was someone with American citizenship when he still lived in Cairo, by virtue of his father having gotten American citizenship when he came to the United States during World War I to escape the draft under the Ottoman Empire. So that, and the fact that he was a Shami, that is an immigrant or of an immigrant family from Greater Syria in Cairo, the fact that he was not only Christian, but that he was an Anglican, which was, of course, the religion of the British occupiers, he was in many ways not at home. Even in Cairo. So when he does come to the United States as a very young lad of about 15 in the early 1950s, he arrives right in the middle of the Cold War, which obviously turns him off. All of his cultural associations, his habits, his tastes are British, not American. And yet he comes back to the United States in order to preserve his American citizenship. It's a very odd place to be. But here, the key thing, I think, is this, that we think of him, of course, he's identified with exile. He wrote about exile. He's writing about the Palestinians. He's writing on behalf of Palestinians who are largely living in exile. This empathy with that condition, but the fact that he's living that condition as well, that is, he's writing about Palestine and identifies with it, but is not there, that is authentic to Palestinian experience in and of itself. The other side, I would say, and this is the last part of my question, or of my answer to your question, is that he is somebody who lived counterpoint in a quite different sense than the one I was saying a minute ago. That is, this is a fellow who in the morning would write his lectures, for the classes that he was teaching that day. He'd spend the morning then on the phone with a political activist that he was helping to organize. Then he would be getting, letters from the UN and calls from Japanese newspapers, and he'd be dealing with that. And then in the afternoon, he runs off to a TV studio to debate Gene Kirkpatrick on the nightly news. So to keep in balance these different melodies, as it were, of his everyday existence is a quite astounding thing for those of us who have studied his life and know how difficult it must have been to hold all these things in such a delicate balance. And he did it so beautifully well.
Yeah, well, and that is very relevant, I guess, to to the position of the intellectual as a professor at the university. And I think he brings about something revolutionary in the academia. What does the academic can do, or what can the academic do, in a time of catastrophe? This is distinct and unique.
Right.
Well, I just want to, I guess I was informed that many people are not allowed maybe or can't get into the Zoom. So I would urge all the audience or those who can't log in, maybe they can watch the video now at the archive page. So I'm sorry for interruption. Anyway, so back to the same context of the Edward Said counterpoint. But I would now, I'm a little bit concerned with what's going on in Palestine. So right in the aftermath of the Oslo Accord in 1993, Amos Oz, the Israeli writer, and Edward Said were interviewed by the BBC. Amos argued that the Oslo Accord was the second greatest victory for Zionism. And ironically, the same point of view was foretold by Edward Said prior to the signing of the treaty. In what ways would you read Edward Said's intellectual stance towards Oslo, Yasser Arafat, and the multiple forms of oppression and injustices in Palestine, the Middle East, and elsewhere?
Well, he took a great gamble, I think, in coming out so forcefully and so uncompromisingly to oppose the Oslo Accords, because almost everybody, including many of his former comrades, said, let's give it a chance. The positive energy that surrounded that in most people's minds was folly to argue against. And even close associates like Hanan Ashrawi, for example, at first did not. They went along with it, even though they were opposed, particularly to the undemocratic way in which the PLO leadership decided to go forward with those accords. So Edward turns out, in retrospect, of course, to be prophetic and to be absolutely right in his diagnosis. But it was something that he risked cutting himself off and being no longer relevant. So it was a very, very important stand. Close friends, like a political activist that he knew throughout his life, was the best man at his wedding, Sami Albana, told him that this was a political suicide. And Edward, with a great deal of anger and maybe not a little depression, said to him that this was simple opportunism on Albana's part, that this was tantamount to not speaking out against the Vietnam War, during the 1960s. So this is, I think, what's happening here, and I think what's also important to appreciate about this courageous stand is that Edward had been indefatigable in humanizing the image of the PLO leadership, and Yasser Arafat in particular. He might have disagreed with him, but during his formative years in Beirut in the 1970s, as he got to know Arafat personally much better, he had an enormous admiration for Arafat, as a personal admiration, the courage, first of all, to take on the position that he did and to put himself in the sights of the Israeli military, but also his tenderness, his compassion, his willingness to take notes. He'd always walk around with a pencil and paper and take notes whenever anybody was around him. So there were a lot of personal features in this relationship that made him tender in his relationship with Arafat. He genuinely and sincerely admired him, but this is what made it difficult. By the time it was like the late 1980s, after the Tunis conference, where there was the Declaration of Palestinian Independence, there were all kinds of danger signs that the PLO leadership, instead of trying to win the moral high ground by appealing to the public, instead was seeking back channels, trying to make deals with heads of state. And Edward said this was going to be disastrous, and it turned out to be disastrous.
Absolutely, it was an absolute sham.
Yeah, because the Oslo Accords didn't didn't put the Palestinians one step closer to an independent state. All it did was preserve the PLO as an organization and recognize them as the legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. That's what all of the
of the Oslo Accord was dehumanizing for Palestinian people. It was just 2 lines written by Israel, whereas 1 page and a half.
I guess I wasn't completely aware of how beautiful and prolific Edward was in publications, either English language or there. You know, the amount of humor, the appeal to autobiography, you know, the use of drama, you know, I mean, it's really quite a remarkable artistic and intellectual performance. And when it comes to Oslo in particular, it isn't just that he took this courageous stand, but some of the most, you know, excitingly vituperative writing that he came up with by denouncing this. You know, it's denounced in the most colorful language. And you really see some of his rhetorical gifts, I think, in this moment of anger and depression.
Absolutely, I guess later on. But let's go to one of the prominent writers with Constantine Zoraite. Ibrahim Abu Lughod has a profound impact on Edward Said's political consciousness and third worldism. How far Zoraite and Abu Lughod have shaped Said's vision of the Arab world?
Absolutely impossible to overstate how important they are in his formation. Although he meets Ibrahim Abu Lughod as an undergraduate at Princeton, right as he's about to graduate. Abu Lughod is a little older. He's a graduate student, but by chance, he was going off on a fellowship to Cairo, and Edward was taking a year off before going to graduate school, and he went back to Cairo for that same year to work in his father's business. So this early meeting that they had still at Princeton became a real full-fledged friendship over the course of that year. It's very important. I would say that Abu Lughod did a couple of things. He recognized in Edward a rather developed political consciousness as a Palestinian that was not yet organizationally expressing itself. The line on Edward is always that he was apolitical and he only sort of was forced into politics after the Naksa, the setback in 1967. I think I've shown in my biography that that's not true. He was writing political essays as an undergraduate, and he was known as a Palestinian who spoke out on Palestinian issues as a very young man. So I think that that's the first thing, is that Abu Lughod recognizes that this guy has a political drive and a certain genius for it. And he tries to bring that into expression. Number two, he teaches Edward about the anti-colonial liberation movements, especially what was occurring right then in Algeria, and changes his way of thinking so that it's no longer about sort of moral outrage at the wrongs done to my people, and it's more of like, let's organize. Systematic resistance can in fact be effective. So I think that the other thing is that Abu Lughod was willing to take, as you know, their friendship developed, a back seat. You know, that he was willing to be raising the money and making the contacts and bringing everybody into contact with one another and thinking institutionally and organizationally, while Edward was the kind of walking encyclopedia, the performer, the charmer. And they became this 1-2 punch. They were absolutely devastating together. Edward gets noticed by the FBI, actually, because of the papers that he delivers to the AAUG. That didn't exist when they met, nor did the PLO exist when they met. And so this was sort of, both things were happening together. Family friend. Let's not forget, he says, that culture is an important element in political transformation. That's music to Edward's ears. But it's kind of this calm, avuncular, but urgent message to his people about how to deal with defeat that I think he learns from Zurek. Even though their politics are not the same, Zurek is much more the liberal establishment and Edward's much more radical than that. He learns a lot about how to do things from Zurek.
And this is so ironic that later on in the late 80s, Idris Said got disenchanted by Abu Lughod. I guess he was siding with Saddam Hussein, and there are many other reasons, I guess. So would you just elaborate on that in 1 minute or so?
Well, I think that there was, I think that they remained friends. And when Abu Lughod died, Edward, with the kind of loyalty that he showed to all of his friends, wrote this fabulous memorial, I think, in the London Review of Books, where he called him his guru, okay? That's pretty strong praise. So if there was tension between them when both were alive, it didn't show itself in this retrospective glance. I think that there were personal differences between them. I don't think that they necessarily were the kind of personalities that blended that well. There were, the things that happened between friends. There was a rather nasty breakup of the marriage between, Ibrahim and his wife Janet, and that probably played a part in a certain amount of distance. But I wouldn't overplay it. They continued to have not just a cordial, but a kind of mutually loyal relationship, regardless of whatever personal differences existed between them.
And what struck me is the ways in which Edward Said was obsessed with the notion of affiliation as an opposite of the notion of affiliations. And I think that it applies to Ibrahim Abu Lughod to a certain extent.
I think you're quite right. Maybe they achieved affiliation perfectly well, but maybe the affiliation, this feeling of blood brotherhood, was perhaps not where they actually resided.
Absolutely. So in your latest biography of Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said, you argue that Said's obsession with Theodor Adorno is central to his interview with the Israeli journalist Ari Shavit in 2000, in which Said argued ironically, "I am the last Jewish intellectual. You don't know anyone else. All your other Jewish intellectuals are now suburban squires. I'm the last one, the only true follower of Adorno." End of quote. Cornel West interprets Said's argument as a form of solidarity with Jewish marginalized and oppressed status, whereas Judith Butler believes that Said's argument can be applied to all forms of oppression, be it Armenian, Jewish, Arab, or anything else. How would you reconcile these different perspectives in light of Said's intriguing argument?
Well, I think context really matters here. I mean, the particular event in which he said this, actually, he said it twice, but maybe let's just, for the purposes, our purposes, talk about this one event. Ari Shavit was here conducting a kind of roundtable with a live audience, and he was basically telling people in the audience that Palestinians should just forget the past. I mean, what's done is done. Let's move on from here. This was his message. And even certain people from, who were Jews in the audience stood up and said, what are you talking about? I mean, isn't this what we have, as Jews, always said, right? Never again, right? We never want to forget what happened. I mean, to preserve that history is essential if we are to get the dignity that we are fighting for and that we deserve. So there was this act of betrayal of the very traditions of Judaism, actually, in its political mode, that Ari Shavit was there guilty of. And I think Edward just kind of looked at him and said, "Look at you, you hypocrite. You've already lost the moral high ground. Think of the traditions that you are betraying by taking this position. Think of figures like Spinoza or Marx or Trotsky or Isaac Deutscher or figures like this who, make the point that their own radical challenges to the powers that be during their own days, and they all were quite radical, right? And this is part of the Jewish tradition, right? Came from their marginalized status in part, right? But also came from their unwillingness to speak only to the tribe, as it were, right? That they wanted to overcome Jewishness in the form of a universal appeal to the downtrodden. They secularized their experience. And I think that that's exactly what Edward's doing and that Adorno did. And so that's what he's saying. He's saying, look, we're both Semites, right? I mean, anti-Semitism has in fact shifted from Jews to Arabs in the West. And yet I'm the one who's carrying on these traditions that were formerly associated with Jews, not you.
And the same thing applies to Chomsky.
Exactly.
And it's a very powerful affiliation between Edward Said and Chomsky. Although maybe I guess they hold different perspectives in politics, and the kind of politics in Palestine. But at the same time, Chomsky, I guess, argues maybe somewhere a few years ago in a kind of interview that Edward Said is one of the few intellectuals in modern time who are speaking truth to power.
Very much so. I think, when one reads the course.
So Edward Said, Edward Said's first Arabic translation of Orientalism by Kamal Abu Dib is undoubtedly a disaster. The second Arabic translation of Orientalism by Muhammad al-Anani was unfortunately another disaster. So the first translation was intended to invent a new awkward Arabic lexicon and jargon that render the translation obscure and unintelligible, as the second one has made the translation oversimplified in various ways. Do these Arabic translations impact Said's reception in the Arab world?
Actually, that is something that you might be able to speak to more than I, although I certainly have interviewed lots of people who've commented on both sides of this, pointing out exactly what the influence of Edward was and is in the Arab world. For a time, for example, it was absolutely required for Israeli students to read Orientalism. And I know that among Edward's books that have been translated, perhaps out of place, his memoir is the one that is the most widely read. So there is, I think it's fair to say, I think I'm correct in saying this, that there's recently been an attempt to get a new translator for Orientalism. And I believe it's Rana Idris who's going to be translating it. But so there's these efforts to find somebody who both knows Edward's intellectual points of departure well enough, and who, of course, knows the languages well enough to do him justice. In a way, I have to say that one of my hopes for the biography that I wrote was to explain Edward, the political activist, but also the literary theorist and intellectual interested in questions of philosophy, and also his musical sides, in all those sides that perhaps did not get across because of these bad translations to readers in the Middle East, so that they could, in an accessible way, so that they could understand how all of these things fit together and are all very, very important for his impact. Because as wonderfully beautiful and as novelistic as his memoir is, it doesn't really, as a book, tell you why he matters as an intellectual. And so the only other thing I would say about this is it's not only bad translations that have gotten in the way. It's a very, very important book by Edward, The Question of Palestine, which he published in 1979, right after Orientalism, you would think would be welcomed in the Middle East. And in fact, it was not. In fact, Zurek himself wrote him and said, what you're doing is brilliant, and it's a breakthrough. But people aren't going to like it here. It's going to hurt your reputation. In part because, among other things, he is railing against the authoritarian governments of various Arab countries. And this is something that at the time, particularly in the late 70s, they could not accept. So that gets in the way. And then, of course, there's other things that get in the way. The fact is that so much of what made him tick, so much of what made him effective as a performer in public, as a speaker, had to do with what literary study had taught him. And so that part of his makeup, these early books, when he's kind of finding his own as an intellectual, is translating French theory into language that people can understand in the New York Times. It's really kind of amazing that he did this, but he did this. This whole side of him is something that's probably very difficult for audiences in the Middle East who haven't been trained in the Anglo-American Academy to appreciate, right? So I think this probably also gets in the way. There's political problems. There's also the intellectual problems that are impasses or obstacles to his being completely understood.
So do you think it's somehow paradoxical that Edward Said, the writer of Orientalism and many other brilliant books, was more into this Anglo-American background, teaching very or different narratives of modernism, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, and the likes. So at the same time, he's the one who is supposed to be the godfather of post-colonialism.
Well, there's so much to say about that because, I was studying under him in just those years that he was moving from Orientalism, which he had just published before I entered graduate school. So it hadn't still caught on. It wasn't the big event that it later became. And the publication about, 10 years later of A Culture in Imperialism, which was his attempt to actually address writers from the third world. And it was his attempt to locate and to articulate an indigenous third world theory, right? I would say because I was there during that transition and I saw him and got to know him very closely during that time, that Edward only very reluctantly opened up his mind to writing from other parts of the world. That wasn't his first love. There were exceptions, of course, because he was always dedicated to bringing Arab fiction to people's understanding. So he knew about Naguib Mahfouz very, very early.
Yeah.
And it was very key in getting him published at Doubleday.
And circulated. Right.
And circulated. But and that's not only him. I mean, obviously, he had a lot to do with Elias Khoury's getting noticed and many others. What is that? Said, the ill-fated pessimist novel, for example. So there are these third world thinkers, mostly Arab, that he is aware of and cares about. But he slowly came to these other things. Now, why? Is this a contradiction within him? Is he really like a secret Westerner or something like that? I mean, how do we think about this? There's a couple of things. I mean, one of them is that Edward thought of the university as a refuge of some kind, right? That there should be a kind of open inquiry that is freed up from the agendas of politics within the university. He would never use the classroom, for example, to try to convert people to his point of view. Never. So there's kind of a utopian element of the university. There's an open-mindedness and a free inquiry that he wanted to appreciate. And, the fact is he loved modern British literature. This is what he formally taught, right? I mean, you can't read one of his political essays almost without it being illustrated by references to the novels of Conrad or the poetry of William Butler Yeats or Gerard Manley Hopkins. He loved this stuff. He lived it. It was a part of his being. What did it have to do with his politics? It didn't. It didn't have to.
Absolutely. And to my surprise, that in the 80s, Edward Said published a very interesting and brilliant piece entitled on Mahmoud Darwish in the Grand Street. And I guess this is the first ever English piece written on Mahmoud Darwish at that time.
And of course, he uses a line from one of Darwish's poems for the title of his photo text collage with Jean Moore, one of my favorite books of his, After the Last Sky.
Yeah,
I
the
would
air
say
that
even,
presses on us, something like that.
yeah, yeah.
He uses exactly a lot of quotations by even in Culture and Imperialism, he uses different kind of quotations by Mahmoud Darwish.
And one of the
Now
most, yeah,
let's move
go
to.
ahead.
I want to ask you about Out of Place. So before Sa'id set out in 1992 to write his memoir, Out of a Place, he was involved in writing a novel that took almost 5 years or so. And this is one of the motifs of your latest book. As you say, Sa'id rejected the novel as a literary form, saying it no longer had meaning. So would you please elaborate on Sa'id's unfinished novel and how is Out of Place aligned with his unfinished novel?
Okay. Yeah. First of all, he tried to write two novels. So he spent a long time trying to write a novel when he was still in college and between college and graduate school that year in Cairo. And that novel was set, in fact, in Cairo. And quite a lot of it is written, although he never finished it. So he dropped that as he went on to graduate school. The second one was much later. It was in the years right before his diagnosis with leukemia in 1991. And that was a kind of John le Carré political mystery novel set in Beirut during the 1950s period of crisis when American troops were invited into the country. So when he says that the novel no longer has meaning, I quoted that. That is something he actually said in just those forms. But what does he mean by it? I mean, as we've just established, obviously he taught novels for a living, and he internalized them. They mattered deeply to him. He would always reread the novels that he'd read 100 times before when teaching them in a class. So he doesn't mean that he's jettisoning the novel as a form. That would be absurd. What he does mean is that for a person like him who was very sensitive to the fact that he needed to write and to reach people in more than one key, that he needed to experiment and not always display the same mood in the same kind of genre. So, for example, he does have recourse to autobiography very often. He is writing frequently about music. He made films. He wrote about film. He would write about anything and everything, even in popular outlets like Interview Magazine or Ladies' Home Journal, this kind of thing. This is what he did in order to show people his entire personality, that he wasn't only some polemicist who's angry all the time. So I think that he wanted to explore the novel as a form, as a way of getting at a certain element of his own divided existence and, difficult to articulate experience, because it was a different mode. And so he could do it in a different way. He never finished it, but I think he would have finished it. He could have finished it. He's good enough. I mean, I really love his prose when it's fictional prose. But when he was diagnosed, I think a couple things happened. One was that he wasn't sure how long he was going to live, and he wouldn't have the time to write that novel and the memoir at the same time. And so he chose the memoir. And he, if you will, indulged his novelistic tendencies and talents in the memoir, as he did in the book he wrote immediately before making this decision to drop the novel. And that is After the Last Sky, which is, for those of you who know it, a kind of personal and subjective response to the photographs of day-to-day life in the Palestinian territories, the very territories that he can't visit and he can't be in. So it's this kind of wonderful imaginative projection into an experience that he doesn't really know firsthand and is admitting that he doesn't know. Okay, so there's all of that. But here's the thing that really tips the scales and moves him to put the novel down is this. His point throughout his career was that while there's all kinds of resources given to novelists in American culture. While there's constant press attention being paid to the latest utterance of an author of fiction, that almost no respect is paid to intellectuals. And he felt that the intellectual is the most important figure, that they're the ones who preserve historical memory. They're the ones who push power in the direction of new policies and new agendas. They're the ones who think of possible worlds. Right? The author reflects reality. The intellectual transforms it. And he wanted to hold out for the intellectual. And that's why I think he did it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, do you think that that's why Said was somehow at odds with the mainstream American novels of the canon? So he feels somehow that most of these writers are not that much engaged in, the international issues, including the masters of American novels, like Tom, the author of Tom Sawyer, Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that there are exceptions, though, and it's important to say that I think you're quite right in general to point out that the novelists of his own era, people writing then, didn't interest him very much. But there certainly were differences. The exceptions, and the exceptions would be Philip Roth, for example, who he corresponded with and liked a great deal. In fact, he loved and wrote a fantastic review of The Counter Life by Philip Roth, which is a story of a father's relationship to his radical daughter. And so Philip Roth. Paul Theroux, who wrote stories that, unlike most American novelists, actually had to do with America's imperial involvements abroad. That interested him. And then there are certain schlock novelists, the kind of bestseller type of novelists that don't require very much thought, that he got interested in, right? He read he read Dr. Zhivago when it came out, when he was an undergraduate, and read it in one evening, and was very proud of having done that. So there are these exceptions. But why he wasn't that interested in the novel is something that I think you've articulated right now very well. That it's it's what the poet Ezra Pound called the obscure reveries of the inward gaze, right? This didn't interest him very much.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So that would lead me to another question. The sources of Said's self, to use the phrase of Charles Taylor, are manifold, and obviously Vico and Ibn Khaldun seem to have shaped a secular consciousness within Said's paradigm of thinking and interpretation. How does Ibn Khaldun contribute to Said's intellectual method of literary interpretation? And how is that coupled with Said's form of secularism?
That's an excellent question, and it's a very, very interesting one, and one that he never really made that clear. I mean, he wrote a couple of essays on Vico and Ibn Khaldun, and of course, for those of you who don't know about these two thinkers, they're related to one another quite independently of Edward. It's very clear that Vico, well, it's not necessarily the case, but probably Vico knew the work of Ibn Khaldun, even though he couldn't cite it because he lived in Naples under the Inquisition, and you can't cite Muslim authors. But he undoubtedly knew about some of the central arguments of his introduction to history, right? And from French translations. Anyway, it's this. One of the key motifs, one of the key terms in that introduction to history, but this idea of group feeling, and over the course of this wonderful investigation of Ibn Khaldun, where he's turning his attention to what makes the cultures of the Arab settlers of North Africa different from the Berber peoples, right? He really is talking about the different ways to understand group feeling. And arguably over the course of that long book, he is trying to say that group feelings should not be understood only as family, as blood ties, that it can also be understood, and in more, the implication is in more sophisticated societies, it reaches to the point of common goals and trends and tendencies and tastes and alliances and those kinds of things. So we have again the affiliation relationship very clearly being dwelled upon by Ibn Khaldun, and I think that it probably influenced him greatly in coming up with those two terms. But there's lots of other things about the book that are just perfect for Said's understanding of what an intellectual is and should become, and how literature and the study of literature and language are intimately connected with our understanding of society and history. So, for example, at the beginning of this introduction, Ibn Khaldun says, there are good histories and there are bad histories. Some histories, in fact, are filled with errors. And why are they filled with errors? Well, they trust authorities too much, or they're biased, or they're, so he has this whole litany of things that one should be avoided. The implication is that it's possible to actually write a history of the past that is accurate versus one that is inaccurate. And this is very dear to Edward. This is something he really wants to hold on to, because he's writing and thinking in a period of intellectual life in the United States where this idea of a history that happened that can be recovered accurately and faithfully through texts is under attack. A lot of people say there is no such thing. It's all invented. It's a fiction. And he is really eager to show that that's not the case. So this would be another thing. But another thing would be that, Ibn Khaldun, stop me if I'm going on too long, but Ibn Khaldun is somebody who quite amazingly puts forth unambiguously in this medieval text, 14th century text, a labor theory of value, right? That he's interested in, his history is going to be different from other histories because different cultures and peoples are distinguished from one another on the basis of their forms of social organization. So he creates this link between how we organize ourselves socially, under what kinds of governments, and what it is possible for us to think and what we value.
Which is a paradigm shift.
Yes, a paradigm shift. A lot of people say, oh, Ibn Khaldun is just repeating, the Nicomachean ethics of Aristotle. And I'm sorry, that stuff cannot be found in Aristotle. This is him. To go on, Ibn Khaldun was a man of action. He was a diplomat. He knew kings. He was counselor of kings. He was sent as an emissary. He was a part of government, and yet was an intellectual. I think that Edward emulates that. Finally, he studies language and literature. He thinks of the writing of literature, that is, Ibn Khaldun does, as one of the natural crafts. It's the essential part of the economy of any society. I could go on, but you get the idea that there's so many different ways in which Ibn Khaldun is influential on Edward in these respects.
Absolutely. Maybe there are some limitations of Ibn Khaldun in terms of the intellectual position held by him. And I guess Ali al-Wardi talks about that. And he alluded, to these political positions held by Ibn Khaldun. Anyway, so my last question, since we're running out of time, drawing on Said's withholding essay, which was published in Arabic in the literary journal Mawaqif, he argues that the Arabic language has been stolen from Arabs by reducing Arabic to the language of God. How is that associated with the Arab built-in intellectual and epistemological flaws, since they can't come to terms with any possible form of revolution or radical social change?
Okay. I would begin, I think, by saying that my understanding of Edward is not that he would believe that for Arabs or Muslims, revolution would be unthinkable or social change impossible. This, in fact, is one of the things that he's accusing Orientalists of arguing. And so he's quite opposed to this position. Quite specifically, Bernard Lewis made this argument, this very argument. And it was one of the bones of contention between him and Lewis. So that's the first thing to say, that he doesn't believe that. he does make reference to, the Arabic being the language of God, the implication being that if God speaks Arabic, at least this form of classical Arabic, then that language is perfect and cannot either be altered or changed. That would be the implication. But I don't know. I think that Edward doesn't dwell on that particular point per se in the withholding essay. The withholding essay is one that I wish more people who speak English and only English knew. It's never been published in English. It's a direct address by Edward to an Arab audience. And really what's most on his mind is that from his point of view, and he might be wrong about this, I'm prepared to believe that he was wrong about this, but he believed anyway, Edward did, that what our people, my people, as he would think of it, don't have, that the West has, is a developed theory of mind, right? That it's not able, like the West is able, to explain, desire, fantasy, displacement, condensation, these things that prevent people from just directly communicating what they feel and think, or explaining people's actions in purely overt or logical ways. He's saying we don't have that, and because we don't have that, we're unable to be sufficiently self-critical, and we're not able to understand fully who we are, right? So, like he at the end of this essay, he cites Othello, and says, that Othello is thinking that his real problem is whether or not his wife has been unfaithful to him. But the real thing that is troubling Othello, and that he doesn't recognize, is that he doesn't know who he is. He himself is. So this, I think, is his point. He wants to bring a kind of more sophisticated theory of mind into the discussion of political analysis. And he's doing it in the name of something, because he's at work on this book, Beginnings, at the time. And really what's at stake in that book has to do with, is a Levantine, like myself, doomed to simply repeat, the gestures that have been given to me by the colonial authorities, right? Can I begin again? Is it possible to be original while continuing a Western lead? That's kind of what he's interested in. So this is also something that's addressed in the essay, and I think is really kind of at the heart of it. Not the issue of the unchanging character of the Arabic language, although his study of classical Arabic in 1972, while writing Beginnings, he of course is completely fluent in spoken Arabic of different types, Cairene, Palestinian, and so on. But he goes back to study classical Arabic in Beirut in 1972, and so there the debates. The rich theoretical debates about language within the Arab traditions become very influential on him as he attempts to fight certain tendencies in the American Academy, because this is the rise of deconstruction, and people are talking about the plenitude of meaning that means that we can never truly interpret a text, and this kind of thinking. And he says this is all old hat. They all talked about it a long time ago in Arab circles. And I take my stand not with those who are trying to, weave these delicate webs of a complex and uninterpretable meaning, which he associates with the Pinist school. He says, I'm a Zahirite. I'm one who believes in clear and apparent meaning and in spoken language. And that's really kind of his theme through his entire career, is to press this vernacular directness.
Mm-hmm. And as far as the point of the theory of the mind is concerned, it reminds me of beginnings, the notion of beginnings that is used and reiterated by Edward Said in various contexts. So as a form of agency. So would you just please elaborate on that for 1 minute?
About agency?
Yeah, in relation to beginnings.
The idea in Beginnings, put most simply, is that there's a fundamental distinction between an origin and a beginning. Mm-hmm. An origin is religious. A beginning, which is a related notion, is secular. An
Interesting.
origin has an absolute point of, starting point, as an absolute. It's sort of done by fiat, uh, by
Mhm.
divine sources, whereas a beginning is always contingent. One can always begin again, and one can always copy in an original way. And this, I think, is it's a very complicated book. It's a very wonderful book for those who have time for it. But on the one hand, he's sort of arguing against those literary modernist figures like Eliot and Pound and those kinds of people that would have mattered to his English department buddies, who are trying to say that as modernists, we don't have any need for tradition. We're inventing ourselves and we're making it new. And he's poking holes in that, saying there is no such thing as making it new. We are all involved in actively choosing the traditions that we want to form us. This is why he breaks from Foucault, because Foucault doesn't believe that there's any agency in history. He just believes that there's these
Absolutely.
anonymous
Even
epistemic
the
shifts.
notion of power,
Right,
the notion of power, according to Foucault, is problematic.
right. But whereas the subtitle of Beginnings is will and intention, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's quite clearly addressing itself to the question of agency. But of course, he's playing a double game. He's also thinking not just of modernists, and the whole kind of debates that would be going on in English departments.
Mhm.
That's kind of code. What he's really talking about is what it's like to be a Palestinian intellectual from the Middle East who's thought to be belated and stagnant and paralyzed, and to fight against that and to show how one might do so by thinking of the new departure and the inaugural step, in a new, fresh way that takes account of historical repetition, that admits and concedes historical repetition, but shows how every period is created by the people within it in a new way.
Interesting. So I guess we are running out of time. Now, let's go to the questions, Timothy. We have
Yeah.
a few questions, and I'm hoping that we can respond to maybe most of them. I will begin with this question by some of the people attending our meeting. How far Darwish's poem Tibaq or Counterpoint describes Said's definition of identity?
The part of it that you quoted, I think, covers it rather well, except that I would say two things about this. One of them is that Edward was rather hostile to a politics of identity.
Mhm.
In other words, it's of course obviously essential in certain moments to speak as a Palestinian man, or in others as a New Yorker, right, or as an American citizen. And he spoke from those points of view, those personal identities, at various times in his career. But he didn't want. He's a humanist, which is to say, also a universalist. So his approach to the whole question of the inequalities created by colonialism is not to try to hold out a space for a unique identity that can never be polluted by mixture with the other, which is, of course, one kind of response, maybe even a valid response, but it's not one that he chose. He would rather try to say, we are all involved in the same thing, right? Like in culture and imperialism, he says our histories are intertwined, right? We have different cultures, but our histories
Absolutely.
are intertwined. And therefore, in order to fight against discrimination or inequality, we recognize that which is human in all of us. And we understand that we are really kind of striving for the same things. So that's one side of things that I would bring up here in regard to the Darwish poem, that the kind of identity that Darwish probably was referring to wasn't one that necessarily should be associated with identity politics or the insistence on a unique identity. Okay. The other side of it is that Edwards very often was out of place in a larger sense. The title that he gave his memoir until the very last moment was not out of place. It was not quite right, which expresses something else, right? It's something about Edward that is very important, that he was anguished and driven and in psychological turmoil. And he wasn't just as a Palestinian, feeling himself in exile or foreign. That was part of it. But I think as an intellectual, the body of his ideas and convictions were out of step with the people around him. As a person, he couldn't easily articulate what was bothering him. So he just was at war with himself. And this is part of what's going on in the question of identity, certainly for him.
Mm-hmm. So another question here, how the West academia dealt with Said's critique from Mahdi Amil, Ijaz Ahmed, and Wa'il Hallaq. I know that this is a very, complex question.
It is a complex question. I mean, okay, I would say there's two kinds of things to say about this, at least, and they're very different kinds of things. First off, I would say that the way that Ijaz Ahmed's critique, for example, was dealt with in the American Academy was deeply unfair to Ijaz Ahmed. That he had a point, and he was saying things that needed to be more seriously contended with and dealt with. And instead, given the anti-communist common sense of American culture, and given the fact that the post-colonial mentality at the time wrapped up in a kind of post-structuralist theory, which was itself, I think, genetically anti-communist in its very foundations, in the work of the nouveau philosophe Michel Foucault and others, right? Or Jean Lyotard and other people who applauded the fall of the Berlin Wall and said it was the victory of US capitalism and so on and so forth. This kind of thing is there among people who identify themselves as being critical and on the left in the American Academy. So they could not take seriously the kind of critique by Mahdi Amil and Ijaz Ahmed. They probably didn't know about Amil, but they did know about Ijaz Ahmed. So that's one side of it. The other side of it, though, is that those critiques, and I myself wrote a review of Ijaz Ahmed's book, which was critical, not completely critical, but was somewhat critical, is that I think that they were unfair to Edward at the same time. That the problem of representation, that is what Orientalism is primarily about, is tricky because it involves two different kinds of thing. One of them has to do with political representation, like I voted for my representative, and the other one has to do with the ability, or the attempt to capture symbolically in language a reality to which it refers. And both things are at work, but they're not capable of being judged in the same way. So I think that when Marx talks about they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented, he's talking about representation in the former sense. He's talking about the vulnerability of the French peasantry to fall for the strongman figure represented by Napoleon III. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about this problem of representation in Edward's sense. And I don't think that any of these figures, including Sadiq al-Azam, right, Edward's close friend, who wrote a very long and devastating critique of Orientalism along these same lines, that they gave enough attention to that kind of distinction.
Mm-hmm. So another question raised by Raghda Muhammad Shqir, in which he said, we had a great hope in Places of the Mind that it would talk more about the personal life of Sa'id, but this aspect was only mentioned in a few pages in the last chapters of the book. And I saw that you didn't address the speech to curious persons like me, those who don't belong to the competence of comparative literature. Rather, it was directed to a specific class of persons with specialized intellectual specialties. So can we have a special gift for us curious?
Okay, I guess I would respectfully disagree. I think that the book is filled with personal color and anecdotes and stories of his personal life and evocations of his character and the recreation of dramatic situations that show him in his element and so on and so forth. So I think that if you would, and it's not only at the end of the book, it's at the beginning and in the middle and in the end. It's all through the book. So I think that it is, in every sense, a full-bodied, in the blood biography. However, when I was asked to write this book, I was asked to write an intellectual biography. So I had to figure out, as best I could, how to make these ideas that I knew about so well, having studied with Said and having been in the same field, how to make them accessible to everyone. And I very consciously wrote it not trying to write just for academics. It's written in a very simple prose that's very accessible, and it is. I'm thinking about Middle East activists. I'm talking about area studies people in anthropology. I'm talking about middle-brow journalists. I wanted all of them to be able to understand it, and I think that they can. The problem comes in is that you can't, however much you are aware of the need to speak across constituencies in a book like this, one thing that has to happen is that the role of the intellectual has to be foregrounded, because that couldn't be more central to Edward's life and his project, his self-understanding, and everything about him, right? If you're not telling the story of an intellectual, and if you're not trying to say why an intellectual matters, and showing how this particular intellectual got formed as an intellectual, and why his being formed that way allowed him to do all these things, to make such a difference, to defeat people in debate on the nightly news, and to be the unofficial spokesperson for the PLO. I mean, if you're not doing that, if you're not showing the connection between these books of philosophy and literary criticism that he read and that, then you're not telling Edward Said's life. So
Absolutely.
I think both things are there in the book myself, and if you disagree, that's certainly a privilege. But that's my answer.
I couldn't agree more, especially after reading your book, to do justice, to our interpretation of the book. I guess the interplay between the personal and the intellectual is juxtaposed in a very pressing way, and this is not a compliment. Anyway, another question raised by Hiba, talking about epistemological emancipation. Why Said built his post-colonial theory in English, and why there is not Arabic writing by Said?
Well, there's a couple things to say about that. One of them is that he found himself in the United States. That was his home at the time. He actively considered moving back to the Middle East and made efforts to do so. He was going to work at a research institute in Beirut, and his wife Mariam talked him out of it. But there's many reasons why he stayed in the United States and stayed in New York. And I think one of those had to do with the fact that he felt that the future of the Palestinian people had a lot to do with American public opinion, and that he had figured out from his years here, and also given his individual talents, how to speak to public opinion and to affect public opinion. And he certainly did that. He changed the conversation single-handedly over Israel and Palestine in the United States. So inasmuch as he had a reason, both personal and intellectual and political, to remain in the United States, it's a given that he will be working in English. So it's kind of not the necessary outcome, but it's the inevitable outcome, the one that you would expect for that reason alone, sort of passively. It's not that it needed to be in English, but it was in English. And it was also the case that he wasn't really creating a post-colonial theory. I think this is really important, that the body of work that is now associated with post-colonial studies is one that he was often at odds with. He would never publicly condemn it, but was far too interested in issues of personal identity, and far less interested, as he was, in the creation of independent states. he was very much a part of the 1960s and 70s anti-colonial liberation movements mentality. This is how he saw what he was doing. He saw Orientalism not as a work of scholarship alone, but as a tool in the fight against imperialism. And so I think that it isn't exactly accurate to say, whether it's in English or not in English, that he was busy developing the theories of post-coloniality. He wrote a book that was influential enough to produce that outcome, but he soon lost control over what was going on within the field and was very much opposed to many of the things that were going on in the field, even though he thought that there were good things about it. I mean, it was opening up the curriculum to new books and new kinds of thinking from outside the West, and it was opening up, very importantly, institutionally opening up jobs of authority within academia to people from the former colonies, and this is very important. Why didn't he write in Arabic? He did. He did write in Arabic. And according to my sources, he could write just fine in Arabic. The latter part of his life, when he wanted to address in a more ongoing and consistent way an Arab audience, he wrote for, of course, several different Arab publications. Some of those publications were published in Arabic and some in English. When he wrote for the Arabic publications, he originally would send the articles written in Arabic to them. And for whatever reason, they didn't want them in Arabic. They made him write in English. And then they translated them into Arabic. But because they didn't really know his references very often, his points of departure, his assistants, his wife, and he himself had to then retranslate it to make it coherent. So it's a much more complicated question, this whole relationship to Arabic. It's probably the case that he never really mastered classical Arabic the way he should have, like scholarly Arabic. He could give talks in it, but probably not as convincingly. But he certainly was capable of writing in Arabic and did.
Mm-hmm. So our next question by Kara. Do you think that Said uses some of Spinoza's ideas in his work of beginnings? You already mentioned that, but you may elaborate on that.
Well, I think he doesn't talk very much about Spinoza, actually, and I know that there's an enormous interest in Spinoza these days. It's kind of a Spinoza revival over the last 2 decades in particular, and so it's something that he largely missed because he was dead before it really took hold, at least in the American Academy. I think that Spinoza was somebody who was an important political and intellectual example to him, but there's no evidence that I can find that he's wrapped up in his thinking or his theories. He certainly is, at a certain point of his career, interested in the writing of Gilles Deleuze, although Deleuze's book on Spinoza is never referenced by him. So I would say that the connection there is a tenuous one. I would go maybe even a little bit farther than that and say that his enormous and obvious investments in the work of Giambattista Vico, right, who's writing just in the wake of Spinoza's fame, shows that he would have been, in fact, hostile to some of Spinoza's findings on the grounds that Vico was. If you know Vico's writing, he's writing in the 1720s through the 1740s. 1744, I think, is the date of publication of the final version of the New Science. That Spinoza is taken on directly by Vico in a number of places, and I think Vico says rather disparagingly that that Spinoza writes as though society was completely made up of traders, people who trade for a living, business people, right? So I don't know if we have time for me to go in and explain what he meant. Maybe it's enough for you just to get a flavor of the feistiness with which Vico denounced the implications of the philosophy of Spinoza, who he thought was objectionable for denying human agency and for believing that the world was perfect as it was, and that human beings were a part of a perfect God, and that they were really kind of motivated by things that had very little to do with their will and intention. It had more to do with the unfolding of this perfect plan. And I think that world that is conceived of as all mind, the mind of God, in which we're just these, elements within it, is, for well or ill, that image is one that Vico abreacted to, and that Edward did as well, by implication.
Yeah, it seems to be very groundbreaking, actually. Another question raised by Mus'ab. What is or how can we locate Edward Said position on BDS and the one-state solution? And the BDS came after the death of Edward Said, so.
Yeah, I mean, the BDS, as many of you probably know, has taken aim at the West Eastern Divan Orchestra, which was one of Edward's proudest, achievements at the time. But I think I agree with Edward's sister Grace, who is very involved in the BDS movement, that Edward, were he alive, would be involved in the BDS movement. Maybe critically, but he would be involved in it. In other words, he might make distinctions about what kinds of things should be boycotted, but he would be involved in it. And I say this for a reason, because when he was still alive, he was very, very vocal about disinvestment, divestment from any businesses doing, any kind of work in the occupied territories. And he was very angry at some of his colleagues who were allies in other respects for not joining him in boycotting efforts of those kinds of companies. True, that's rather narrow, I suppose, in its focus, but it shows a little bit about his sensibilities in this respect. And we've all seen what we've seen. I mean, it's become a kind of a nightmarish outcome with, under the Trump administration, openly talking about the outright annexation of all Palestinian territory and recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I mean, these kinds of things would probably have made Edward be ever more inventive in the variety of organizational tools at our disposal to oppose this atrocity.
Okay, the last question, I don't know if you can just respond to the question briefly. This question raised by Wood. In his book, Orientalism, Said had adopted as a method the philosophy and the speech of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. For this reason, the reception of this work, especially in France, seems important. But what do you think, or why Said remains poorly read and poorly known in France? What disrupted its reception in France? What do you think?
Okay, I mean, first of all, I would push back a little bit about the degree of the Foucauldianism of Orientalism. I think that Orientalism is very clearly has much more relationship to the spatial linguistic theories of Antonio Gramsci and the idea of the country and the city put forth by Raymond Williams, and other Arab sources, obviously, Philip Hitti and Larouille and others. That is the intellectual world that it primarily is being reflected in his concerns and how he writes about them in Orientalism. It's a fighting book. It's a book that is really kind of like talking about the end of the Vietnam War and why is there not a mass movement against what's happening in Palestine of the sort that got people out into the streets against the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. So this is its sensibility. Now, he obviously is taking certain things from Foucault, the idea of discourse, obviously, the idea of an institutional language that has a kind of a power in deciding what can be said and not said and how it is said, and so on. That is, in fact, there, and he would admit it, but in some of the ways that we've already covered, it is explicitly anti-Foucauldian, and he says so in the preface to Orientalism. He says, I'm not with Foucault when it comes to agency in history and the idea of the choosing of one's own intellectual traditions. These are things that I believe in and Foucault doesn't, and therefore I'm not with him there. Okay. France. The whole question of France is another question. First of all, the French intellectual scene, if I can put it this way, is parochial across the board. It isn't only in relationship to Edward. That's one thing. The other thing is that some of the people who, the nouveau philosophe, André Glucksmann, and I forget some of their names now, but they'll come to me in a minute. But they form a kind of cabal, they have enormous amount of power. They have access to all the major newspapers and crossover magazines, and I think that they have always seen, or did always see, Edward as a danger to their authority because of his cosmopolitan flair, the fact that he's fluent in French, the fact that he plays music and knows all about the classical repertoire, the fact that he's just charming, the fact
He's a
that
polymath.
he's a polymath and he can hold his own in any kind of public forum, and he could run circles around them. And they were wanting that not to happen. There were inroads, right? There were, Pierre Bourdieu invited him to give lectures at the Collège de France. That's kind of important. And there were, in fact, memorials held in France after he died at the Sorbonne. So it's not like he's unknown there, but there was some resistance. So I think part of it has to do with the parochialism of the French intellectual scene, and part of it has to do with this grating against the higher echelons of the well-known public French intellectuals who saw him as a rival.
Well, thank you very much. This is a wonderful talk, Timothy. I would like to thank you on the behalf of the Library Archive and the whole wonderful team. Thank you very much. And I would
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I was really very appreciative, not only of your very thoughtful and complex questions, which I really admired, but also the wonderful questions we had from the floor, even the testy ones. I loved it all. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess we are looking forward maybe to having another meeting in the near future. So we're going to keep in touch.
Good. Hopefully in person.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Okay.
On top of that, I would like to inform the audience that this video will be is already recorded and it's going to be uploaded on the page of the Archives Library. Thank you, Timothy. Thank you for everyone, and see you soon, hopefully in person.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.